Okay, in this lesson we are going to cover the general features of arguments. For this section, we are talking about the features that all arguments have, what they share in common. Every argument out there has these features. It doesn't matter what type of argument, doesn't matter what kind of reasoning. I want to remember the word argument and reasoning are synonymous. But it doesn't matter what kind, doesn't matter what's going on. Whenever we reason, there's certain features of it, and so this is what we're taking a look at here. Now, there are fundamentally three features that arguments, reasoning, thinking possesses. Okay, so let's walk through each of those three, and I'll have a few things to say about each point. The first feature of reasoning is always a conclusion. Whenever there is reasoning or thinking going on, there is a, begin quote, what, end quote, to believe. There's always something that I want you to accept as true, or that's offered to be accepted as true or to be believed. Now, a conclusion can be any claim, or I should say, rather, that any claim can be a conclusion. God exists is a claim, that can be a conclusion. Excedrin is better than Tylenol is a claim, and that can be a conclusion. Pencils are better than pens, that's a claim, and that too can be a conclusion. Cheese is good for you is a claim, and that too can be a conclusion. As long as there is a what I want you to believe offered, then you have a conclusion. And that's what the conclusion of an argument is. It's always the thing that is the what to be believed. Okay? The next feature is the premise or premises. These are, or this is, the why to believe it. Why to believe that the conclusion is true. Any reasons I give you for thinking that the conclusion are true are what we refer to as premises, or a premise. Now, you'll notice that the word premise / s, I'm referring to singular or plural. An argument will only ever have one conclusion. For one argument, there is one conclusion. If you happen to have two conclusions, then you have two arguments. But premises, an argument, a single argument, can have one or any number more premises. I have dealt with arguments that have over 100 premises to get to a single conclusion. It's not something I will ever expect you to do, and it's not something you do in common. That's something that was done in the process of a very advanced logical proof that I had to do for a course one time. You will not be asked to deal with those sorts of arguments. Nonetheless, it is very common for arguments to be given 2, 3, or maybe 4 premises. 4 reasons for a single idea, to believe a single idea, a conclusion. Now, I'll have more to say about premises and conclusions and arguments and how many arguments are actually there. You can have more than one argument for the same conclusion. Premises can be used as premises can be a conclusion in a prior argument. So I can have an argument where I conclude something, and then that same conclusion can turn around and become the premise in another argument. But generally, the two features are the premises and the conclusion, and every argument will have premises and a conclusion. That is, every argument will have a what to believe, conclusion, and reasons why you should believe it, premises. Okay. Now, I used plural there, but it could just be one. Keep in mind. Okay. Every argument that you encounter must have these two features. Okay. If they do not have a what to believe and a why, then you are not looking at an argument. For example, if I just assert to you that iPhones are better than Samsung Galaxies, which is true, of course, I just assert that. I have not given you an argument. Remember, an argument, as we are considering it for this class, is not a disagreement. It's not something that's contestable. What we mean is the reasoning process by the word argument. So when I say, or I simply assert, or I make the claim that Apple iPhones are better than Samsung Galaxies, I'm giving you something that very well could be a conclusion, and you might find yourself asking me or pressing me, well, why should I think that? Notice that that question is sort of asking or prompting me to give you premises, reasons why I would believe that, reasons why I think that that's true. But the claim itself that iPhones are better than Galaxies is not an argument. It is just a potential conclusion. It's not even a conclusion, really, because in order to be a conclusion, there has to be a complete argument there. As it is by itself, it's just a simple claim. It's just a claim. It's either true or false, but we have no argument. Arguments are not about true or false. They're about establishing true or false. And when I go to establish true or false, there is the assertion that I want to establish, conclusion, and the premises that I want to utilize, or the ideas that I think show that that conclusion is true. Those are the premises. Those are the ideas that I think establish that conclusion is true. Every argument must have both of those features. The absence of one of them tells us that it's not an argument, it's just a claim, just a single simple claim. Okay? There is a third feature of the argument, a third feature of reasoning or thinking, and that is the inference. Now, an inference is the movement of your mind from the truth of the premises to the truth of the conclusion. I typically, in courses, as I diagram arguments for you in this course, I will very often utilize an arrow to symbolize the inference. And literally, the inference is that moving of your mind from the truth of one idea to the truth of another idea, or the truth of one set of claims to the truth of another specific claim. That's the inference. So let me try to illustrate to you all three features in some sample arguments here. And I'll have some that are arguments and some that are not. Now, let's assume that there's a claim that I have for you. John is at the park. This is a single simple claim. I do not have an argument here. I'm not presenting to you an argument, because while John is at the park might well be true, that by itself doesn't make it an argument. And that I assert that John is at the park, that also doesn't make this an argument. It's an argument when John is at the park either provides reasons for believing something else, so John did not commit the crime, or when John is at the park is something to be believed on the basis of something else. So, for example, if I were to assert that John is at the park, but also assert, that John said he was going to the park today, now I have both elements. John is at the park here. This claim here that John is at the park, this is the claim that, let's see if I can get rid of that actually. Can I do that? No. This claim here is a claim that is to be accepted as true on the basis of this. How do you can hear yourself saying, how do you know? Well, because John said he was going to the park today. That means that this claim here, that John said he was going to the park today, provides some basis for believing that John is at the park today. So really what happens is, and here's the inferential arrow. Oh, did not want to do that. Here's the inferential arrow. No, didn't want to do that. Here's the inferential arrow. It means that John is going to the park today, supports the idea that John is at the park. If he said he was going to the park now, that provides me some reason for thinking that John is at the park is true. So the idea is that I am to accept this as true because this is true. And this provides a reason for that. Now, let's assume that instead of asserting that John was at the park, I made a different claim. Let's say I said that, well, Christmas is in December. Notice that the idea that Christmas is in December has nothing to do with John being at the park. It doesn't establish that at all. It has nothing to do with it. It's an independent idea. It's a claim, and it's true, but the truth of that claim doesn't establish or make it reasonable to believe that John is at the park. So that is a bad inference. Now, imagine somebody came up to you and said, you know, John's at the park, and you replied to them, well, wait a minute, why should I think that? And they came to you and said, well, Christmas is in December. You would likely look at them cross-eyed and start to think, you know, are you, smoking crack? Like, what's going on here? And you would immediately recognize that it being Christmas in December, the fact that Christmas is in December, has nothing to do with John being at the park. That doesn't mean that that's true. Just because Christmas is in December, I'm not justified in believing that John is at the park. What you're recognizing at that point is, while the person thinks that they're offering a good inference from the truth of one claim to the truth of another claim, they're really not. So Christmas is in December has nothing to do with it. That's a bad inference. But they're still giving an argument, by the way. This is important to note, that when they give that to you, when they give you this, John is at the park, and you say, why think that? And they say, Christmas is in December. You ask them why to think that. They're giving you a premise. But what you recognize is that premise has nothing to do with that conclusion. Okay? So the inference, that's the inference. See, this idea leads to the idea that John is in the park. The idea that John said he was going to the park today provides some reason to think that John is at the park today. That is, the truth of this first claim that John said he was going to the park today provides a reason to think that it's true that John is at the park. This claim, however, does not. That Christmas is in December does not reasonably establish as true that John is at the park. That's the difference between inference and non-inference. Another way to think about it is whether or not the premises are relevant to the conclusion being true. See, in this one, that John said he was going to the park today, that's relevant to the fact that, to establishing that John is at the park today. But the fact that Christmas is in December is utterly irrelevant to establishing whether or not John is at the park. It has nothing to do with it. Okay, now, consider this claim again. Because arguments, I said, can sometimes have more than one premise. Now, when an argument has more than one premise, those additional premises function in a very special way, in a certain way. They are cumulative towards the conclusion. So if I wanted to prove to you that John is at the park, or at least make it reasonable for you to believe that John is at the park, I'm going to give you an argument. Now, my argument then must have premises. Now, let's say that I wanted you to believe that John is at the park, and I said, well, it's noon on Tuesday. Well, now, you're rightfully probably going to say, well, that doesn't establish that John is at the park. It's noon on Tuesday, great, and there are, 44 prepositions that I memorized in 8th grade. Great. What does it have to do with John being at the park, right? Christmas is in December, yee-haw. But now, it's noon on Tuesday. That claim by itself doesn't mean that John is at the park. There are other claims that I can couple with it. Oh, wrong arrow. For example, if I were to say that, add to that claim that John always goes to the park at noon on Tuesday, and it's noon on Tuesday, notice that that will then imply that John is at the park. Now, what's important to note here is that establishing my conclusion as true, that John is at the park, reasonably requires two ideas together. Neither one of these ideas by themselves will establish as true that John is at the park. Both claims must combine to form that evidence. So if I were to come to you and just give you the first claim, John always goes to the park at noon on Tuesday, John is at the park. So John is at the park, or therefore John is at the park. That doesn't clearly establish that John always goes at noon on Tuesday, if it's Wednesday or it's Saturday, is not going to provide for me a good reason to believe by itself that John is at the park. I have to add to that the idea that, oh, and it's currently noon on Tuesday, and once I do, now our mind says, oh yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, so John is at the park. Or at least that's reasonable to believe. But it doesn't become reasonable to believe until both claims are set up. So now, some claims are given with just one premise, and the idea is that that one premise makes the conclusion reasonable to believe is true, or provides a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. Some arguments, however, need more than one premise. This is why we talked about the idea of a premise or premises, which is the plural form. Some arguments will require more than one idea to establish the truth of the conclusion, more than one premise. It will require premises. And so there we go. Now a couple extra points here. We're talking about how arguments are supposed to work, not how they in fact always do. Now, here's how an argument is supposed to work. You are supposed to believe the conclusion is true because the premise or premises are true, and because the truth of those premises imply, that's the arrow, the truth of the conclusion. Now, that's how they're supposed to work. But there is good reasoning and there is bad reasoning. That means there are good arguments and there are bad arguments. Good arguments are arguments where the premises do in fact imply the conclusion. Bad arguments are where the premises do not imply the conclusion. They're both arguments. There is just a big difference between good and bad arguments. So long as somebody gives you a what to believe and why, or reasons why, they are giving you an argument, even if their reasons why have nothing to do with the conclusion being true. They have just, in that instance, given you a bad argument. Okay? Now, when it comes to the inference, keep in mind that it may seem obvious to you that John is at the park. Well, let's try a different argument. Consider this following argument. All dogs are mammals. Goofy is a dog. Therefore, Goofy is a mammal. Now, my conclusion is that Goofy is a mammal. Why do I want you to believe that Goofy is a mammal? Well, that argument has the same structure as the argument here on this slide. All dogs are mammals, which is the equivalent of John always goes to the park at noon on Tuesday. All dogs are mammals, and Goofy is a dog. Now, if it's true that all dogs are mammals, and if it's true that Goofy is a dog, then those two ideas give you a good reason to believe that Goofy is a mammal. Okay. Now, it will seem obvious to many people that, yeah, Goofy's a mammal. Of course Goofy's a mammal. I understand that the conclusion is true. The question in an argument is not, is the conclusion true? It's, have I given you good reasons to believe that? That is, can I know that that conclusion is true on the grounds of the premises? Okay? A good argument is one in which the premises provide a reason to think that that conclusion is true. So it's not just, don't think of an argument as just the assertion of a conclusion. It really is this relationship between the premises and the conclusion. And the purpose of the inference is to say that that conclusion can be known to be true from these premises, from these other ideas. Okay? All right. Now, there's one other point that I should make about arguments before we close out this quick lesson. Arguments, the premises, and sometimes the conclusion, can be unstated. That is, sometimes I can give you an argument and not actually state one of the premises, even though it is assumed. So look at the argument on the screen now. Let's say that we worked in an office together and you asked me where John is. And I said, John is at the park. John always goes to the park at noon. I've now offered you an argument with an assumed conclusion. Let's assume that it's noon on Tuesday and we both know that. And I'm assuming that you know that. Then I don't need to state overtly that it's noon on Tuesday. It would be assumed. I can provide you then an argument with a premise that is not stated but just assumed. Take another example. This one comes from prior lectures. Let's assume that you came to me at the end of the term and I had a policy that if you received an A on the final, you would receive an A in the class. And I do not have that policy, just to be clear, but let's assume that I had that policy. And you came to me and you said you wanted to know if you got an A in the class. And my reply to you is, yes, you got an A in the class. You got an A on the final. Now, if I just assert you got an A on the final, that you get an A on the final doesn't automatically guarantee that you get an A in the class. There are other classes that you have where that's not the case. So when I assert that to you and I say, well, you got an A on the final, I'm assuming that you also know that anyone who gets an A on the final also gets an A in the class. I'm assuming that you're aware of that policy and that you know that. And in fact, if you don't know that policy, you'll likely ask me, well, so then anybody who gets an A on the final gets an A in the class? You'll ask me if that policy is true, that missing premise is true, to get you to that conclusion. So sometimes premises can be sort of obvious and unstated. They're still giving you an argument. And when you're thinking critically about an argument, it's one of the first things to do is to make every single premise explicit and clear. Don't leave anything assumed. When you're critically evaluating an argument, look back at any premises that have been assumed, or I shouldn't say look back at, but look for any premises that have been assumed but not overtly stated. If I came to you and I said, oh, of course Goofy's a mammal, Goofy's a dog. There's a premise in there that we need to close that gap, and that is that all dogs are mammals. And I have not overtly stated it, but we both know it to be true, so it doesn't need necessarily to be stated. But if we were to formally state our argument, we would need to include that premise. The other thing is that sometimes conclusions can be unstated. You probably won't get this much in a formal argument, but we do use this all the time. If my kids come to me one night and they say, hey Dad, are we having pizza for dinner? And I say, well, you didn't clean your room. And you know that you had to clean your room to get pizza. So and then I don't say anything, notice I've given them both of the premises and I'm leaving it to them to draw the obvious conclusion. There's a conclusion there, and the answer is no, you're not getting pizza. But I haven't really stated it. I've just said, well, I told you you had to clean your room and you didn't clean your room. So no, you're not getting pizza. I don't say, so no, you're not getting pizza. I let them draw that inference on their own. And I've still made an argument at that point. I just have not overtly stated the conclusion. There is one, and it's assumed, but it's not overtly stated. So that works both ways. Okay, that covers what I wanted to talk about for the general features of arguments. So there we go.